All right, thank you. Okay, ready to go.
All right.
That is mine.
No,
it's nice.
Yeah, so it's time for the
Yeah,
talk.
exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Gabriel Samlo. I'm going to try to get the introductions over with quickly. I work for Carnegie Mellon's CERT, which is the sort of OG CERT the U.S. government started back in the 80s after the Morris worm because they suddenly realized computers were going to be a thing they were going to have to care about. The cool thing about that is I get to indulge in my paranoia and OCD in a professional capacity, which is much, much better than it sounds, probably the way I make it sound. I'm going to probably sit down during this presentation every once in a while when I need to, work the demo a little bit, so don't think that's weird. So with all of that out of the way, we're going to talk about self-hosting and why that's important and how it impacts things like hardware and the ability to trust it. And then further into that, sort of distinctions between ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits, dedicated silicon versus programmable FPGAs, and what the threat models are and the trade-offs and how much you can trust each one of those, and what you're gaining and losing when you're switching between them. And then next will be a demo of what probably is the slowest, most memory-constrained computer that's capable of running Fedora Linux that you've seen recently. It will be on a 50 megahertz Rocket chip CPU, soft-core CPU running on an FPGA. It's going to have 512 megs of RAM in this particular incarnation. It is using, like I said, Rocket chip and Litex on an FPGA with free open tool chains, Yosys, Trellis, and XPNR, being used to build a bitstream for the FPGA. And then this computer, when it runs Fedora, you can install Yosys, Trellis, and XPNR on the computer that was built using those tools and run those tools on the computer to rebuild bitstream for its own motherboard. So it's basically like a self-contained, self-hosting thing, which is really exciting. So let's start with this whole idea of self-hosting. Most of you are probably familiar with what that means. The joke is, well, no, it's not me hosting my own content on Google Drive or somewhere in the cloud, but rather it's a term of art in the field of compiler design, and it means a compiler is written in its own language, and it can compile its own sources. And then there's a related concept of bootstrapping, which is basically kind of, well, you have a self-hosting compiler that built its own sources, well, chicken and egg, which one was there first? Well, there had to be a third-party trusted compiler that was originally used to build the first binary of our own compiler before we could rebuild it. And at some point, we reached stability where the next iteration of the binary we build out of the sources isn't significantly different from the one we already used. And that basically means we've achieved self-hosting. And the process for that is called bootstrapping. And one interesting thing about self-hosting compilers is that they suffer from this attack that Ken Thompson pointed out, Ken Thompson being one of the designers of the Unix operating system, among many other glorious achievements. He pointed out that a compromised binary of a self-hosting compiler could be created that attacks clean, otherwise sort of benign, trustworthy source code and builds malicious binaries. One being of, like, the scenario he described was the attack against the login program, which if you build a login program, it'll have a backdoor root password that will allow somebody to log in without knowing the actual system root password. The other thing this malicious behavior does is it inserts itself into any subsequent iterations when it detects that the compiler's own sources are being built using it. So it's a self-perpetuating attack that isn't actually present in the source code. And the only way to get rid of that would be to rebootstrap the entire compiler, because presumably we do trust the sources and the sources are clean and there's no malicious behavior specified in the code itself. And one way to not necessarily get rid of the problem, but to point out or to test whether we have been subjected to one of these attacks is David A. Wheeler's PhD dissertation called Diverse Double Compilation. And in the example here, we'll be using CC as our suspect compiler and TC as the third-party compiler. And it's not necessarily T for trusted, it's T for third-party. And the heuristic here is that we pick the third-party compiler in a way that gives us a high degree of confidence that it is not in collusion with the suspect compiler. So the people who put it out aren't the same group. Think maybe GCC on one hand and MSVC, Microsoft on the other, or something like very diverse. That's where the word diversity comes from. The way this works is that if we compile the sources of CC with both our own sort of suspect binary and with the third-party binary, if everyone's innocent and no one's trying to screw us over, what should happen is we should be obtaining binaries reflecting the sources of CC that are functionally identical, because these are diverse, different compilers. They would produce different code, like the code generation would be different. So the binaries aren't like bit by bit identical, but they should be doing the same thing because they're implementing the same source code. And then if that is true, then the next move would be to take the sources to CC again and rebuild them with our two intermediate compilers that we obtained. And if you control for the initial conditions, if you have the same initial condition, same random number generator seed and everything, and identical input pumped into functionally identical binaries, the result should be bit by bit identical. And if that's true, then we can breathe a sigh of relief and say, okay, we aren't subject, or we are very unlikely to be subject to a trusting trust attack. And that degree of confidence is sort of equivalent to our heuristic ability to pick a third-party compiler that isn't in collusion with our suspect compiler. And by the way, the highlighted box on the bottom here is basically the process of bootstrapping CC using, the third-party TC compiler. So back to self-hosting. If you have a self-hosting compiler and source code to everything, the binary of the compiler, when it operates, when it runs on top of, a C library and the kernel and basically a software stack. It's an application on top of that, but it's an application that can compile all of the things it needs to run itself. And if you have source to everything and you've compiled everything from sources that you otherwise trust, then you have a self-hosting software stack built around your compiler. And sort of the applications are bonus, all the stuff you actually want to use the computer for, if you build that from source. But the stack of software, with the C compiler at the top, systems, libraries, kernel, and whatever you have underneath that for the software is a self-hosting software stack. And examples of that we have in the wild. There's the Linux ecosystem, there's the BSD ecosystem. Those are all sort of compliant to this, with this idea. Now, there's kind of a holy war going on with, whether hardware will respect your freedom or not. And some people are claiming that, hardware should be completely immutable and never, upgradable with firmware or anything like that in order for it to be completely, respecting of your freedom and no binary blobs. And different people say, well, you may actually be able to, put free firmware blobs on your proprietary firmware blob-enabled hardware of today if you just reverse engineer it and so on. But anyway, the idea is, in order to, trust the computer, it's not enough to just have a self-hosting software stack. We need to understand what hardware does. And hardware, as we've learned in recent years, isn't really hard at all. It's very, very mushy, very complicated. It does all sorts of things that scare us, and we need to kind of take a closer look at it. And so software talks to an instruction set architecture and a bunch of registers that are mapped somehow. And that's basically where software talks to the hardware. That's the DMARC here. And then there's all sorts of layers underneath, microarchitecture, whatever. It all ends up with this register transfer level, which is combinational and sequential logic, basically a bunch of gates, a bunch of flip-flops, a clock, and so on. And It's not my word for it. It's just a word I picked up from the wild. I don't know exactly who to attribute this to, but these layers of the hardware stack are typically referred to as gateware, and it's the stuff you write in something like Verilog or VHDL or MeGen or Chisel and so on. And then obviously all of this has to run on actual physical hardware, which could be dedicated circuits, application-specific integrated circuits, or optimized silicon, or programmable FPGAs. And so if we have free software toolchains for HDL compilers for making gateware out of sources, which we do thanks to the group who put out Yosys, Claire Wolf, and the GateCat, who made the Trellis and the next PNR place and route software. So anyway, if we have those things, those are software that can be built by the self-hosting C compiler, which can compile the software stack. Now, this thing can take source code, HDL sources, and build all the layers of gateware, which then support all the operation of the software stack. So you have a self-hosting software plus gateware stack. Unfortunately, that leaves, for now, out the actual physical layer, the silicon versus the FPGA. So this is as far down the layers of abstraction we can go with self-hosting that I'm personally currently aware of. And so being a relative late comer to developing hardware, I'm a software person, have been my entire career. Took a couple classes at the university where I work, learned Verilog, learned a bit of digital design, and it surprised me to realize that essentially designing gateware is sitting down in front of a development environment and writing a program in some kind of functional / declarative syntax, like Verilog and VHDL. You basically write a program and then hit the compile button, and it compiles your code into ever more elaborate, basically graph netlist of building blocks and eventually gates, and then you have a choice of building a binary blob, which is bitstream for the FPGA, and it's basically a binary blob, just like a binary blob comes out of an actual program you write for software. The difference being software will tell some CPU a sequence of steps of what to do, whereas bitstream will tell an FPGA what to be. It sits there and it acts out the configuration that is being compiled into a binary blob. But other than that, it kind of looks like software development to me, and I probably am pissing off a bunch of people for saying that. Now, the interesting thing is if you don't want the FPGA bitstream, but rather would like optimized silicon, then you're compiling, further elaborating your gates and your RTL into a bunch of a very complicated graph of transistors, which then get laid out and made into masks, and there's an entire very, very expensive, very, very involved process of actually etching this into, carving it into stone, so to speak. And we have the saying of, well, is it the dog that wags the tail, or is it the tail that wags the dog? Well, in terms of that, making actual silicon is one stage in a compilation pipeline, like a software development compilation pipeline, just like a 5 megaton tail is wagging a tiny little Chihuahua dog, basically. But if you look at it from a software guy's perspective, it's just one stage of the compilation pipeline. Just kind of figured I'll share that with you. So now we have the option of doing a CPU, and this slide is specifically from the perspective of we're going to make a CPU. And the choices are putting a CPU in dedicated silicon versus putting a CPU in an FPGA. With the dedicated silicon, obviously you have high performance, lower area, high clock speeds. The problem with that is there's from the perspective of the hardware attack surface, one thing we don't control is the foundry, the chip foundry, where we're sending those masks to be made, right? And documented attacks that have been done, so the University of Michigan group had this A2 Trojan at an IEEE Security and Privacy like 3-4 years ago. And what they did was, if you have access to these masks, then you can tell where things are, and you can add maybe, these things have like billions of transistors, but if you carefully understand how this whole thing works, you can put in 20 transistors in the capacitor. And the transistors are wired such that when the CPU, because this is a CPU, remember, is executing a sequence of unprivileged instructions, depending on how you wired those transistors in, they incrementally charge the capacitor a little bit at a time until, at the end of the sequence, the charged capacitor will flip a bit in the register. And if that register is your CPU privilege flag, as in ring or whatever, your kernel mode versus user mode, then you have a baked into silicon privilege escalation vulnerability that relies not at all on any vulnerabilities in software. So if you theoretically had perfect software, you'd still be able to basically do a not a buffer overflow, a privilege escalation attack on a CPU that's been compromised like that. As opposed to FPGAs, which you're asking the foundry, the manufacturing facility, to make you a regular grid of basic configurable blocks. It kind of looks like snap circuits for grown-up engineers, and most importantly, the foundry has absolutely no idea what this FPGA will be used for, and if it's ever going to be used for a CPU, where on this regular grid of identical blocks will the register be that holds the crown jewels to like the privilege ring flags or anything like that. So pre-gaming an attack in this scenario is qualitatively harder for the hardware manufacturing facility because they don't know what you're going to be using it for and where your things are going to be put on it by the place and route software. So the price you pay for not letting them know where your privilege flag is going to be by using software CPUs is basically performance, a huge performance loss. But that's essentially the trade-off. So if we've decided to use FPGAs because we're paranoid and we're trying to deny the Silicon Foundry knowledge of what we're going to be doing, the rest of the attack surface is, if we don't trust our HDL toolchain, but we do because it's part of the self-hosting stack and we have source code to it. And then there could be design defects like bugs in the sources to the CPU. Kind of like, I don't know, Spectre and Meltdown, and you'll never know whether those are intentional or just somebody getting away with like trying to optimize things, plausible deniability all the way down. But if you have source code to everything, you can always just edit the source code and rebuild things, and you have a self-hosting environment which will allow you to rebuild every part of it as necessary. Which is what brings me to this slide, freedom and independence from any sort of black box, closed, non-free dependencies. And you can trust the computer that runs as a self-hosting Gateware plus software stack to the same extent you can trust the cumulative set of source code. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, no one ever reads that much source code and it's impossible to understand. I agree. I don't want to read any of those sources myself, but the cool thing about it is if I ever down the road have a question about, hey, this computer did something weird, I could do a vertical dive into the software layers, the RTL, the source code to the gateware, the source code to the whatever it does weird, I can actually have enough brain power to do one sort of debugging session through it. But in order for me to be able to do that, I need to have source code to everything, and with the knowledge that I'm not going to read most of it. So that's kind of my perspective on this, my ability to trust my own computer. I hope I'm doing okay with time. Are we talking about 15 minutes here?
20 minutes in. So.
Perfect. All right, so I am going to now show you a Fedora-capable computer built on this Lambda concept board. So if you download the PDF from the conference site, the links are clickable, so it'll take you to the place where I ordered it from. It's a commercially available board. Hopefully they'll make more because it was sold out the last time I checked. It uses LiteX and the Rocket chip CPU. It uses Yosys Trellis and XPNR for the toolchain, OpenSBI for the firmware, and then I downloaded the latest incarnation based on Rawhide 37 of Fedora's RISC-V 64-bit port. Thank you, David Abdurakhmanov. He's the guy, like the one-man show behind building most of this stuff, and it's really, really appreciated. If you have Bitstream, well, if you have LiteX and all its dependency installed, and there's going to be a link in the slide deck to more detailed build instructions for this. But it's pretty much a stock LiteX build. You install LiteX according to all the recipes that are available online, and then you run this command line which says, we're going to build it with the Rocket chip, can't highlight, with the Rocket chip CPU, 50 megahertz, I want Ethernet, I want SD card support, I want to use Flow 3 optimization to the IOSIS component of the toolchain, I want strict timing, and I want the register map saved to a CSV file. Now, this is all a little bit clunky still at this point because you're going to have to kind of manually build the device tree table for it. LiteX doesn't build a device tree table for Rocket chip-based designs automatically, and it's one of the things on my to-do list to teach it how to do that. But once you have the generic sort of register map and you know where what the addresses are for all the devices, we have to add like a chosen boot args line which contains the kernel command line for the booting Fedora. And the black font is sort of the standard cut and paste from what Fedora already uses, modulo this root, which is going to be on the SD card. The other thing we need to do is set enforcing to 0, because once we've rsynced stuff from one image to the SD card, the labels are all wrong, and SE Linux is going to scream at us. So we set enforcing to 0, and then the default is to boot into graphical mode. So we have to tell it to use like run level 3 equivalent, which is the multi-user target and systemd. And then last but not least, systemd is really, really impatient because it's used to running on, I don't know, 5 gigahertz, 20 core systems. This thing's 50 megahertz, so systemd will give up on starting services way before the thing actually has a chance to actually start all that stuff. So we need to increase the systemd timeout. Now, enforcing, we could get rid of, like it takes about a day to relabel the whole SD card on the 50 megahertz system, but then you can get rid of this part of the command line because it'll actually work properly with SE Linux. And you can set this as the default, so then you can get rid of the multi-user target, but this should stay because it affects both the initrd version of systemd and the one that actually boots from the real root. Now, once we have a device tree blob ready to go, we make a binary out of it, and then we build OpenSBI. That's another sort of stock. You get OpenSBI to just build itself using a built-in DTB right now. So the other thing that LiteX should eventually be made to do is to build a DTB into the actual bit stream, and then have OpenSBI just kind of take that like it does for most normal computers. For now, we just kind of have to build a binary bitstream thing into the OpenSBI blob. And then we put that on the first partition of the SD card has to be VFAT, and there has to be a boot.json file which lists the OpenSBI blob and its load address, which is the very first address in memory, and then the Linux kernel image and the initrd image. And the Linux kernel image and the initrd image just come from Fedora, or would normally, but I had to do some customizations. The stock Fedora kernel has 2 problems that I'm dealing with right now. One of them is it lacks UART IRQ support for the LiteX UART. And so that stuff is kind of making its way right now. It's somewhere in Greg Cage's TTY next tree, and it's been accepted for upstream, but hasn't made it into mainline yet. The other thing is between the port, the RISC-V Fedora port based on Fedora 33, which was the previous kind of major release of the RISC-V port of Fedora, and the current one, a bunch of config flags have been turned on additionally in the stock Fedora kernel configuration. And I found 2, but I'm working on finding a third one, which, if enabled, will cause the kernel to crash when it boots on this machine, on this computer. And either David will tell me, well, we can get rid of not actually enabling this one because it was enabled by mistake, or if it has to be enabled, then I either have to find a percolating patch for some kernel bug that's already been found, or I have to find it and submit a patch myself. But anyway, that's kind of work in progress. Right now, I'm building a custom kernel, and I'm doing that on a RISC-V Fedora machine running on QEMU for reasons of speed, and I need something to actually build the kernel before I can boot this machine for the first time. And then down here at the bottom, there's a URL clickable link with all of this, but in much more detail that you can actually reproduce. All right, well, perfect, because now I'm going to sit down and actually try to work this demo for you guys. I recorded an ASCII cast of my terminal. And let me try to maximize this. Splitting my screen, and I'm sending the bit stream with OpenOCD. So this is the ECP5 bit stream that I built. I'm sending it to the ECP IX5 Lambda concept board. This is LiteX. This is basically where I type SD card boot. Yeah, I'm going to try to zoom in so you can actually read the screen and see what it's doing. So it's starting to boot, loading. Loaded boot JSON is loading the RAM disk, and if I fast forward, it's going to load the actual kernel image, and then it's going to start booting, and this is what it looks like. It takes a very long time. This whole video, if you have time to watch it at normal speed, is 4 hours long. Well, if it's a 50 megahertz computer, what do you want? So anyway, let's see. If I fast forward to this creatively, you'll see systemd actually booting here and a bunch of OK services being started. Let's see. At some point, we failed to mount var lib NFS, whatever, but we don't care about NFS on this computer. Oh, it also failed to start firewall D. But other than that, it seems to be pretty happy. And at some point, it starts the console. And let me pause this again. Let's zoom in properly so you guys can see what it looks like. So this is a boot prompt for Fedora in text mode. If you don't have IRQ support in your UART, it would trip over itself. GetTTY would basically just kind of interrupt itself before it's serviced its own soft interrupt. So it needs actual IRQ support in order to not crash when it starts. The other cool thing about this is it actually does work on the network. If I nmap my, from my normal machine for Fedora, it'll actually find this. So 192.168.2.229 on my home network was where this Fedora machine actually grabbed the DHCP lease and talked to DNS mask and everything. My attempt to log into this machine took about 20-30 minutes because here's the cool thing, right? You type login and it starts, the login program, and then it starts bash, right? So in order for all of that to work, it needs to be loaded into RAM and linked against glibc and all that stuff, and that takes a little longer than the timeout the first couple of times until it's actually managed to pull enough of it into RAM and actually let you log in. So there's a couple of attempts, and I'm trying to log in both at the console in this window and over SSH. And see here, I actually just succeeded because it says, hey, last login, something, something. That means I'm actually going to get a shell eventually. And Once I do get a shell, I can start, exploring catproc CPU info. Looks like this. Proc interrupts looks like that. I have the UART, I have Ethernet 0, I have my SD card, and this is part of the CPU. The /boot.json, this is the file that told the Litex BIOS what to load into memory. What else do I have here? This is the actual source. I just copied it over to the SD card. So this is the source to the device tree file. And there's my boot args, console, all the stuff we talked about on the previous slides. This is the CPU node. Okay, let's see what else is going on here. My devices, but all of this I had to edit by hand, and I promise I'm going to teach Litex. I'm going to submit a patch to make it generate this programmatically so that I don't have to modify the device tree file every time I rebuild my thing. So long story short, I'm going to fast forward over a lot of this stuff. Once I'm able to log in from everywhere, the next thing is systemd network or resolved is not enjoying itself on this machine, so I had to disable it and stop it and add 8888 and 8844 to an actual hard-coded etcresolve.conf. At that point, my DNS resolution started working. Crony also started working because it could resolve like Fedora, NTP, whatever the alias thing it has in its config file. And once I have all of this ready to go, I type dnf-y install Python 3 Megen Yosis Trellis next p&r, and it's doing it really slowly. But if you have patience or can fast forward, which is really cool, it's a cool feature of ASCII. How do you pronounce that? ASCII, A-S-C-I-I-N-E-M-A, ASCII Cinema? I don't know, but you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Like you can record your, anyway, this is basically what I used here. And so I don't know, we're like 142 minutes into this entire thing, and it's installing RPMs.
How many months or years did the GCC build take?
Well, we'll get to that. We are going to address that elephant in this room, definitely.
And for the release from scratch folks, how long does batch take to build?
Well, so here's the thing, right? So basically, it takes about an hour and plus to install all the RPMs. But then, let me pause this thing at some point. What I did to demonstrate the fact that it can actually self-host is I had a very simple Verilog Blinky, which just makes a counter out of the ECP5 board's LEDs. And if I zoom in here, essentially this is what it does. It has a counter, and the red, LED 0 red, LED 1 green, LED 2 blue, and LED 3 red. It's basically bits 27, 26, 25, and 24 of the counter, and it kind of goes at a couple of seconds. You can actually see it blink. And that's the Verilog, and I'm running, actually, here we go, like the build of this. Here's I have a shell script, I'm running it manually. So Yosis is the first thing that creates a JSON file. Next PNR will do the place and route, and then ECP pack will actually take what Next PNR produces and spit out an SVF file, which you can shove at the actual board on which this computer currently runs. And so I did that, and so in this other window I have top running, and so Yosis is using, I don't know, let's see if I keep going, %CPU, where is %CPU? Right here. So it uses about 80% of the CPU. If I don't know, ManDB, whatever cron starts some process that drops down to 50% because now it's splitting it with whatever thing. So I had to kill those while this was running, just to keep it on task and making progress. Run Yosis, run NextPNR. This is pretty much, if you've run XPNR ever before, you'll recognize the output. It succeeds. Then we do ECP pack to generate the SVF file. And once that is over, I did a MD5 sum of the top SVF file so that when we run the following demo, or when I show you pushing this thing to the actual board, when it starts to blink, here's the checksum of the SVF file. BAE0, yada, 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 618. All right? So at this point, the job is done. It took, I don't know, 50 minutes to build the bit stream. If I pause this, perfect. If I pause this creatively here, I am doing an MD5 sum of the top SVF file, and you'll see BAE0D yada yada 618. That is actually the thing I built on Fedora running on this board. And if I let it run and it goes, then you'll see right now it's like kind of, oh, okay, so here it started blinking, and it blinks exactly like the Verilog I showed you earlier says it should. So I was capable of building Bitstream for this board on Fedora running on this board. And with that, we're going back to the tail end of the slide deck. And we're talking about, right, so building the Blinky on my Intel laptop takes, what, 10 seconds or less. So 10 seconds, ... 90 minutes. Building Bitstream for actual RISC-V rocket chip Litex takes half an hour, ... whatever that translates into. You'd be here a very, very, very long time if you waited for this thing to really self-host itself and rebuild its own Bitstream. It can do it. We've established that. It's the qualitative leap has been done. It's just a quantitative problem now. We need to make this thing faster, right? And so the immediate thing is to figure out the Linux config stuff. Teach Litex how to be more, civilized about booting and generating device trees and working maybe with U-boot or something and actually have a standardized boot process. Light SATA is like they have a SATA core which works on some FPGAs, but currently not yet on the ECP5. In the medium term, right? In order to make this thing a little faster, right? On my VC707 board, I can get 8 cores running at 100 and 150 megahertz, so basically twice or 3 times as fast, and 8 times as many cores as I can fit on a Lattice chip. The problem is, if I do that, it's not self-hosting because I need Vivado to pull that off. I need the Xilinx proprietary tools. So whatever I can do to encourage or join or whatever in the future, the effort to target Xilinx, large Xilinx, not just any Xilinx chips, large Xilinx chips with complete free tool chains, count me in, let me know, tell me what I need to do. I don't have a lot of money, but I have a lot of determination. I'm a very stubborn individual.
That's established.
I mean, all right. Well, thank you. I'll take that as a compliment. No, for real. I got that. We could put in fancier IP blocks. If it's a larger FPGA, maybe we can get away with some kind of video card-like thing, or maybe be a PCI master so we can plug video cards or other cards into this computer. And then in the long science fiction term, I mean, what I'm doing right now is I'm taking a class or a sequence of classes that culminate in taping out an actual ASIC at Carnegie Mellon, which I'm doing in my spare time. I want to understand how ASIC fabrication works because I want to have something useful that I can say about it. Right now, it's just all high level. Oh, yeah, you can't trust the fab, but I have no idea what goes on in one of those things, and I want to know what goes on in one of those things. And then there's been a kid who probably just graduated from their electrical computer engineering department. Sam Ziloof was his name, but he was famous before he joined CMU because he did some silicon transistor stuff on integrated circuits in his own garage, probably with like 70s technology or whatnot, but it's a start, right? And then maybe in the future, it would be really cool if I lived long enough to see some kind of, nano assembler, kind of like a 3D printer in my house that maybe costs as much or less than sort of like the average American single family detached home, or something. Because right now, the way chip fabrication works, there's like you can count them on one hand how many actual places are that make these things, right? And then obviously they have the attention of important people and nation state actors and all this stuff. It would be nice if we could democratize that a little bit more. So that's kind of, if I live long enough to see that, I've either lived a very long life or, something cool happened in my lifetime. Either way, I win. And with that, thank you. Time for questions, or do we do that off? Okay, awesome.
It was a good talk. Just use the entire 40 minutes.
Sweet. Thank you.